Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Africa's creaking energy sector is holding back an industrial revolution.
Satellite imagery of African cities compared to satellite imagery of Western cities at night. You can see the darkness versus the light.
As public and development funding falls, can Africa build the energy infrastructure it urgently needs to grow?
Electricity is a fundamental right. Because without that, you can't have health, education, anything delivered.
A country can't industrialize using diesel power generators because it's expensive. It's a very expensive option with which to operate factories, and it makes you uncompetitive.
On today's podcast, we'll look at what's holding back the African energy sector and where the funding might come from to turn it around. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Later on, we will hear from Dr. Owen Omogiafo, Chief Executive of Nigeria energy investor Transcorp. But first, we're going to start with our Bloomberg energy reporter, Paul Burkhardt, who is joining us on the podcast. Paul, thanks so much for joining us this week. Let's just start with your piece that is now available on Bloomberg platforms now, which really takes a look at the extent of Africa's energy grid and perhaps also what it's lacking. Can you talk us through some of the numbers that you found and how much energy Africa actually needs right now, and then what it's actually generating?
So what we started out with this piece was actually the question of why isn't Africa industrializing faster? And when you look at those numbers, it's only 11% of GDP in Africa is manufacturing compared to like 22% in East Asia. There's also this measure called global manufacturing added that's actually shrunk on the continent from 3% to 2% over the last decade. And you have to keep in mind that Africa is the continent where that'll make up a quarter of the world's population by 2050. So big population, a lot of jobs needed. And the answer to industrialization issue is electricity. And so the difference between African countries and other nations outside of Africa is just quite stark. So consumption, for example, per capita in Congo is like 1% of US consumption. And Nigeria's grid only provides the equivalent of like a very small European countries have. So that's the problem. And if you don't have power, you can't manufacture.
Right. And especially with the magnitude of the populations that we see across the continent. Let's dig into, though, the success, I think we can call it, of Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam, which we saw switched on earlier this year. But in the piece, you described this as an outlier. Why has it been so hard to replicate this model? We know it took quite a long time for them to get this up and running, but why an outlier?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets into the problem that's faced by most countries. And that is because, the typical, usually you would get your electricity from the state utility, but state utilities are often broke. They haven't been able to expand, and they haven't privatized like many have abroad. And so that's the first stop for supply. Also, financing came up as like a huge obstacle due to risk. Another issue is like the end user. Do you build the power station on the expectation that there will be enough demand? So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was really championed and financed by the state and the people. And now they have to pay that back. But they also found a major off-taker, interestingly, with crypto miners. So that takes up about 30% of what the dam produces. So in that sense, it worked out. Of course, it's like a very charged issue because only like 1 in 5 Ethiopians have power. So again, it's kind of this trade-off, like, do you industrialize first and then create jobs from that? Or do you try to connect people to power first? It's just like it becomes very complex.
Is that a similar picture, or in what ways is that similar to what we're seeing in Nigeria? Because a population of 250 million and still only a fraction of the population actually has energy. What are we seeing there that stood out to you?
I think what we see in Nigeria is like a major workaround that isn't really sustainable. So what's happened is the grid just like doesn't work that well. So people rely on generators. And so my colleague Nduka Ojinmo visited a garment factory, and it's just one of countless examples where generators are always like starting up when the grid turns off. Roughly 86% of Nigerian businesses rely on gasoline and diesel generators. So that creates a huge cost, like between the outages and the fuel, that is between like 5 and 7% of GDP. So it really takes its toll, even that workaround. And what you need is just a bigger power source for cheaper and accessible and reliable power.
When it comes to solutions, then, is there any cause for optimism? I mean, we also have to point out that there's still a lot of talk about the transition, right? And yet a number of these countries still need to industrialize. So what would you say? Where are we at right now in sort of solving some of these issues here?
Yeah. So again, it brings up this argument of like finding the off-taker. That's like a very progressive view on the spectrum of approaches. So critical minerals could really be a catalyst in bringing more electricity to a place like Congo that has like some of the richest deposits of cobalt, copper. If they process some of those minerals further by using electricity, that's jobs and revenue. And so what we're seeing are mines run on generators, like the same example as Nigeria, that require a massive amount of fuel. And we're starting to see projects that want to connect transmission lines to hydro projects that are nearby. And the investment in the critical minerals could drive this expansion of the power system. So that's very much a bright spot. The Renaissance Dam is a bright spot, and Morocco was also a country that came up in terms of just being able to draw a lot of investment in renewables there. So one expert that we spoke to, Musa Blimpo, who was a former World Bank economist, said that if the Ethiopian dam works out, and there are a couple more examples like that, African success stories, that momentum will really build from there on the continent.
Thanks so much, Paul. After the break, we're going to dig a bit deeper into Nigeria's energy problems and possible solutions as well with Transcorp CEO, Dr. Owen Omogiafo. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today, we're talking energy and how the continent's creaking energy grid is holding back an industrial revolution. At Bloomberg's Africa Business Summit this week, one of the speakers was Dr. Owen Omogiafo. She's the group president and CEO of Nigeria's Transcorp, a major operator of power plants in the country. Dr. Owen Omogiafo, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe we just start here. We were just given a pretty stark picture of Nigeria's energy grid. Can you give us some insight into what's really held back reliable energy in the country? What's behind a lot of this?
Like you've said, there's a stark picture, a country that has a need for about 45 to 50 gigawatts of power, and our grid today can only do about 6 gigawatts of power. But that is not to imply that the country is in darkness, because the grid can only do so much. But it just shows that you have people who are generating their own power independently. So historically, power system in Nigeria was 100% as a state-owned enterprise, meaning that the government managed the generation, transmission, and distribution of power in Nigeria. In 2013, a privatization exercise took place whereby the value chain was broken into 3 segments: generation, transmission, and distribution. Now, for the privatization, the generation side was 100% privatized. So we in Transcorp, we have 3 power generating plants that we obtained through the privatization exercise. The distribution company was privatized at 60% private sector, new investors, and 40% still managed by the government. Whilst the transmission, on the other hand, 100% stayed under the federal government. So you see that on the generation side, naturally, the discipline of private sector, we run businesses looking at maximizing efficiency and value. The generation capacity has increased in the past 10 years. If I look at Transcorp as an example, The power plant that we bought in 2013, at the time of procurement, the available capacity was 160 megawatts. We've taken it up to about 700 megawatts. If you look at our Afam plant, from 35 megawatts, we've taken it up to 348 megawatts. And this story I'm telling cuts across other generation companies as well, albeit not at the same level of performance for some. Now, when you now look at the transmission, there's been practically no investment at all in the transmission side beyond the, let me say, system maintenance, right? A country that has an installed capacity of 14,000 megawatts of power, your grid cannot be 6,000 megawatts. Now, what are the overall challenges? We have the infrastructure issues that are in there. There is also liquidity. We've had some conversations with the government. We owed quite a bit of money right now, but under the government of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, we are having conversations right now with the Minister of Power, Ministry of Finance, and the Office of the Special Advisor to the President on Energy, where we're having some discussion on how the historical debt will be paid. And this is the most progress we've made in a long time. The sector is one that is profitable, is one that creates impact. And truly, for us to drive the industrialization of Nigeria, we must fix that power sector.
You know, just speaking to that, because a lot of the discussions that I've been having over the past few days around B20 is about the private sector becoming more involved in some of these projects and development across the continent. When we talk about Transcorp, you're planning a few new projects, but how quickly do you see them being able to kickstart and support some of the energy gaps that we're seeing in Nigeria? And I guess maybe you can speak to how quickly other private producers can do so at this point, or if there are still a few bottlenecks and red tape that's getting in the way.
I'm glad that the G20 is having this conversation about the role that the private sector must play in the development of Africa, as well as to balance it out as well, the role of government in creating an enabling environment for us private sector players to thrive. And frankly, that is the principle of Africapitalism that our group chairman, Mr. Tony Elumelu, talks about, which is simple, that private sector has to lead in the development of Africa. And for Transcorp, it's core. Our purpose is to improve lives and transform Africa in everything that we do. And energy is at the core of it. Because when you get power to a location, development will follow. Infrastructure challenges, you find that businesses will situate. And when businesses situate, what do? You're creating jobs. You create jobs, you create economic opportunities. And we're driving this very, very strongly. Nigeria is rich, very rich in oil and gas. We need investments in that gas space. And this is what other private sector players are also doing. There's more investment going on in there so that we're able to generate more power. And within the next, I look forward to when there's no load shedding in Nigeria. And just being in South Africa and listening to the minister speak 2 days ago about this. And that's what I want, where every Nigerian can have that access to electricity, have that confidence that, you know what, I can plan my business, I can drive my business, I can grow because electricity is not a problem.
And that was Transcorp's Dr. Owen Omogiafo. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks again to Bloomberg's Paul Burkhardt, who you heard from earlier in the podcast. You can read his report on Bloomberg platforms now. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Here's some of the other stories we've been following across the region this week. The U.S. formally warned South Africa against pushing for a joint statement at this weekend's Group of 20 summit in Johannesburg that the Trump administration is boycotting. That's according to a document seen by Bloomberg. And Chinese companies plan to help Morocco establish a competitive production base for electric mobility products such as motor scooters, small tractors, and motorbikes. That's according to an interview with Morocco's Industry and Trade Minister, Riyad Manzour. Several Chinese manufacturers, quote, have the intention to localize manufacturing or the assembly of their products in partnership with local companies, he told Bloomberg. And you can follow these stories across Bloomberg, including the Next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Tiwa Adebayo. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. But for now, I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.